a presentation of the Lehman College Political Club. My name is Marriah Star. I'm the advisor of the club. And today is a continuation of the topic, how to get rich. Now, as I said the last time, let's say an ambiguous title because we are articulating rich in three ways. We're looking at social capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital, instead of the typical focus on merely financial capital. Now, we have already discussed, for the most part, the sequence of events. You develop intellectual capital, then you develop social capital, then you translate that into financial capital. Most people have the most difficult time with the intellectual and social part because developing financial capital is relatively easy. You can go get a job, you can find a way to make money, and you can get a bank account anywhere. So it's very easy to make money. The problem is with money, it comes in and goes out very easily. And so what you find is that you might have a job, but it's hard to keep it. So you build social capital and intellectual capital with the objective of developing the framework to keep it. So the framework includes organizational skills that allow you to translate financial capital into productive structures, like housing or legal structures. And you develop the social capital to help maintain the trust among friends. So since intellectual capital and social capital are the hardest to develop, I'm going to focus on first how to develop those elements, and then how to work with financial capital to reinforce intellectual and social capital. So part of getting rich is identifying the needs of your community, the needs of your friends and family, and filling those needs. And of course, you start with your own needs. What is it that you want out of life? So needs are another way of identifying a purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? So whenever we talk about generating wealth or getting rich, you first have to identify your purpose in getting rich. Because if you simply have money, you can very easily fall into mere consumption. You are undisciplined. You can easily become the type of person who's a spendthrift and who's slothful, instead of being industrious. So you want to develop intellectual capital and social capital to avoid that. So how do you develop intellectual capital and social capital? How do you find a sense of purpose? Well, it's kind of hard to tell you in the abstract. I mean, I can give you instructions, I can tell you general rules, but what I've found is that whenever you talk about a sense of purpose, whenever you talk about developing intellectual capital and social capital, you can't talk about it, you have to just do it. And you do it by sharing your story. So what you find is that people who have developed these elements of themselves have a powerful story to tell. You know, they may be survivors of AIDS, or they may have run away from a genocide, or they may have had a hard lifestyle. So I'm going to briefly tell you about how I developed intellectual capital and social capital, and then how I translated that into financial capital, as a way of giving you an example of how you can identify elements in your own story. So, my story is really about a contest between two families. I'm mixed race, and I come from a middle-class family on my mom's side and a lower-class family on my dad's side. My mom's side was very much into education and achievement. My dad's side was very much into just surviving. Now I mention that because what you'll find whenever you try to develop your social capital and intellectual capital is that your formative years, your first steps, are contextualized in your family environment. If you have negative family dynamics, it's much more difficult for you to develop intellectual capital and social capital. And what I mean by that is this. If you try to develop intellectual capital in a family that does not respect it, you'll try to get educated, you'll try to develop ideas, and they'll try to bring you down. You'll try to develop friendships, among your community, and they will try to restrict those friendships. So the two controls established by parents in your community are what kind of values do you have and what kind of friends do you have. There's a curfew, for instance, if you're a parent, and there you can restrict how much time your child spends in the library versus spending in front of the television versus in the classroom. So in my family, there was really no acknowledgement of the intellectual side. There was no concern with intellectual achievement of any kind. Instead, there was solely concern with social interaction, which makes sense since I come from a hippie community. Many of you may not know that, but my parents were hippies originally, and by that I mean I grew up, I guess flower child is not quite the word I would use to describe it, although that's close. I was homeless for the first 8 years of my life. I lived in a car, a green station wagon, and we really just traveled all over the U.S. We mainly the mountain states. We traveled over California, Colorado, Arizona, Utah. My dad was in the Air Force. We traveled to the Air Force bases from time to time. And other than that, we just traveled to different college campuses. We camped in the wilderness. So I grew up having no structure at all. And that was my initial experience. And it got to the point where I was sort of craving some type of structure. And my family life changed when there were initial dynamics occurring. My mom left my dad married my stepmom, all within about the same week. And so I developed very solid structure and foundation really fast. And I knew what was going on, that if I continued to follow down the path of no structure and having no real ability to improve myself, then I would end up largely in the way that my dad's first family ended up. So I'm 5 of 9. My dad was in the Air Force for 20 years, from about 1950 to 1970. He served in Vietnam, and he was married to a woman who had a schizophrenia gene. That gene passed to 3 of her 4 kids, 3 males in my family. And it led them to paranoid delusion, it led them to criminal activity and drug use. And so I grew up around that. I grew up around people who were coming to my dad's house, my parents' house, and asking for drugs. My dad gave it to them since he was selling marijuana at the time. And this is like 25 years ago. And I experienced drug busts. They were right across the street from me. I was able to... hold on a second. Okay, so I mentioned that story because part of my way of finding purpose was saying, if I'm going to go to school, if I'm going to develop my intellectual capital, it must be for a reason. It must be to help solve the problems that I have experienced in my home environment, to solve issues of crime, of drug abuse, of people who are living essentially a purposeless life. So I found refuge in school. And as a result, I found that my talents could be applied to academic situations and then translated back into my family at some point. So this is how I found my purpose. I discovered that I could develop my intellectual capital and then eventually translate into social capital. Now, others of you may have different environments. You might have different conflicts in your own family, different situations. My situation is rather unique because I don't know many other hippie kids out there who decided to go down my specific track in education. But there are other stories. There are people who are from war-torn environments, who have decided to enter business or education in order to find solutions to their situation. So that's your first step. Whatever your situation is, you have to develop a way to transcend it, and then once you transcend it, fix it. If, on the other hand, you don't do that, then what you will end up doing is accumulating the intellectual capital, and the social capital, and the financial capital, and once you reach the end point of doing that, you'll find that you don't know what to do with it. When you reach that point, we call it a midlife crisis. People who focus solely on developing their education and their finances get to be about the age of 45 or 50. They have the marriage, they have the kids, They have the job, the career, the money, and they ask themselves, what's it for? And usually this is about 20 years after they've gone down this track. And the reason that happens is because we've got an educational system that does not encourage self-reflection. It does not encourage people to ask themselves, why are they doing this? It simply bombards them with facts, tests, and extracurricular activities, and tells them, go to high school, go to college, become a lawyer or a doctor, and be a professional. You want to encourage to ask why those are necessary.